Follow along as we talk about one of the scariest cases in Millhaven County, Pennsylvania's history. Just before we start, please leave a comment telling me where you are and what time you heard this story. We want to know where these written accounts come from and what time of day or night they arrive. In Millhaven County, New Hampshire, the fall of 1888 brought an odd chill that seemed to settle into the ground. The coal mining towns spread out across. The rough winters had made the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania used to them. But something new happened that year. A cold that felt planned and almost personal. Some of the people who live in Cedar Ridge, a small town between the foothills of Allegheny and the Yohogany River. The simple ad that came out in the Weekly Gazette on October 15th didn't get much attention. Fine winter clothes that are well made and don't cost too much. Ask at the Hemlock Cottage, which is a mile north of Miller's Bridge. The only thing written on the ad was C. Moravec. Most people in the area knew it was about Cordelia Moravec, the Czech immigrant who moved to Cedar Ridge 3 years ago after her husband died in a mining accident near Pittsburgh. The advertisement stood out not because of its modest tone or the promise of low prices, but because of the high quality of the clothes Miss Moravec had started making that season, in line with, according to records kept by Jeremiah Caldwell's Cedar Ridge General Store, the first people to visit Mrs. Moravec's cottage came back with coats that were unlike anything else seen in the area. The materials looked like some kind of fur, but no one could figure out what kind of animal they came from. The fur was surprisingly soft, and it had a strange sheen that seemed to change from dark brown to almost black, depending on how you looked at it. Even more surprising was how warm these clothes were. Provided heat that seemed to come from the material itself, so even on the coldest days, you didn't need to wear any other layers underneath. The cottage of Ms. Moravec was at the end of a winding dirt path that split off from the main road that led to Miller's Bridge. The building itself wasn't very interesting. A simple house with one story made of local fieldstone and a slate roof that is typical of the area's architecture. The largest workshop shed behind the main house was what made the property stand out. During her first year of living there, Mrs. Moravec built herself. People living nearby sometimes noticed smoke coming from the shed's chimney at odd hours, sometimes late at night. The smell that was carried by the wind was not like burning wood or coal. Some people thought it smelled sweet and almost floral, while others thought it smelled like leather being cured. Reverend Ezekiel's letter is the first written record of concern about Mrs. Moravec's business practices. Whitmore wrote to his sister in Philadelphia on November 2, 1888. Reverend Whitmore was the minister of the Methodist congregation in Cedar Ridge. He also kept detailed records of his community's social and spiritual situations in letters. In this letter, which is kept in the archives of the Philadelphia Methodist Historical Society, he said, "I must admit that I am troubled by the way our Mrs. Moravec runs her business. While I cannot fault the quality of her work, several of my parishioners have. People who have bought her clothes say they are excellent, but there is something about her methods that makes me think. She insists on meeting with each customer privately, and they often do so for more than 2 hours. When I asked her why she does this, she said it's because proper fitting requires careful measurement and consideration of the customer's specific needs. However, I have seen that people who visit her cottage often come out looking different. Not sick, exactly, but subdued in a way that seems unnatural. Others in the community agreed with the Reverend, but not many spoke out about their worries. According to oral histories gathered by historian Marjorie Fenwick in 1952, some Cedar Ridge residents noticed that customers of Mrs. Moravec's workshop started acting strangely after their visits. They became more distant, less likely to attend community events, and seemed to enjoy doing things by themselves. Most notably, they showed an odd. They became very attached to their new clothes and wore them all the time, no matter what the weather was like or what was socially acceptable. Barnabas Hutchkins, a local farmer and frequent customer of Caldwell's general store, was one of the first people to buy one of Mrs. Moravick's coats. Hutchkins had farmed the same piece of land near Cedar Ridge for over 20 years and was known for being very practical and having a strong work ethic. Barnabas went to Mrs. Moravick's cottage on October 20th, 1888, looking for a warm coat for the coming winter. Temperance's journal entries from this time show how things changed slowly after her husband bought the coat. For example, on October 22nd, she wrote, "Barnabas returned yesterday evening with the most beautiful coat I have ever seen. I don't know what kind of fur it is. It's soft like rabbit fur, but has the depth of color of mink fur. When I asked about he didn't say what kind of animal it came from. Mrs. Moravick told him it was a European breed that isn't common in this area. He hasn't taken off the garment much since bringing it home. He even wore it to bed last night, even though it was warm in our bedroom." By November, Temperance's entries show that she is becoming more worried about her husband's behavior. Barnabas has become more distant. He does his farm work but doesn't talk much, even during meals. Most upsetting is his insistence on going to Mrs. Moravick's house. When I ask him about these visits, he says they talk about how to take care of the clothes, but those talks must take less time than the 3 hours he spends there every week. I'm starting to think that the widow has some kind of power over him, but I can't imagine what that power would look like. Other customers of Mrs. Moravick's shop did the same thing. Isadora Fleming, wife of the local bank president, bought a coat in early November, and then started turning down social invitations because she liked being alone in her parlor. Cornelius Blackwater, who owned the biggest farm in the county, bought a coat for his wife Prudence. Within a month, neighbors noticed that he had lost a lot of weight and started walking alone along the riverbank at night when it was the coldest. The workshop behind Mrs. Morav's cottage became a center of interest and worry for people in Cedar Ridge. People who drove by the house at night said they saw shadows moving behind the curtains, even though Mrs. Moravick said she lived alone. The smoke rising from the building's chimney had a strange, sweet smell that seemed to get stronger at certain times of the moon, especially during the new moon, when the workshop seemed to be busiest. Dr. Sylvanus Heath, who was the only doctor in Cedar Ridge and the nearby towns, started to notice changes in some of his patients in the last few months of. The medical journal that Dr. Heath gave to the Pennsylvania Historical Society in 1941 has entries about a variety of symptoms people had who bought clothes from Mrs. Moravick's workshop. For example, patients said their circulation improved and they were less sensitive to cold, which Dr. Heath at first thought was because the coats were better at keeping them warm. Other symptoms, like changes in their appetite, especially an aversion to certain foods, were harder to explain. Others started to have strange reactions to bright light and started asking for evening medical appointments. What worried Dr. Heath the most was that many of his patients wanted to visit Mrs. Morav's cottage more often than their original purpose would have suggested. When asked about these visits, the patients gave vague reasons like discussing how to take care of their clothes or finding more work to do. It seems like few new things are bought on these multiple trips. The mystery surrounding Mrs. Moravick's supplies grew when Jeremiah Caldwell tried to find out where they came from. As the owner of the general store that served the whole region, Caldwell had relationships with merchants and suppliers all over Pennsylvania and neighboring states. He quietly asked about exotic fur traders, European importers, and specialty textile merchants, but no one could help him. Describe the fabric that Mrs. Moravick's clothes were made of. In December 1888, Caldwell went up to Mrs. Moravick directly, supposedly to talk about the possibility of carrying her goods in his store. He wrote about the conversation in a letter to his brother in Baltimore, and it was very upsetting. The woman received me formally, though her manner was strange. She spoke in whispers, even when we were alone, and seemed constantly aware of sounds that I could not detect. When I asked her about her suppliers, her face changed completely. She said that her materials came from family sources in the old country, and that she used methods that had been passed down through generations. But when I pressed her for more information, she became vague, finally saying that some information was too dangerous to share freely. What worried Caldwell the most about the visit was Mrs. Morav's workshop. She only showed him the front room where she met with customers, but he caught a glimpse of the back section through a partially open door. He noticed an open doorway and what looked like big vats or containers beyond. The smell in the air reminded him of the rendering facility near the Pittsburgh slaughterhouse. When he told Mrs. Moravec about this, she quickly shut the door and told him that the back workshop had materials that were sensitive to light and needed to be handled carefully. By January 1889, the strange atmosphere around Mrs. Morav's business had started to affect the wider community. Regular customers of her workshop had become a closed-off group that tended to hang out at each other's homes rather than going to larger community events. They seemed to talk to each other through glances and subtle gestures that left out non-C customers, creating an unspoken divide in Cedar Ridge society. Things got really bad when several families said that relatives who owned Mrs. Moravec's clothes had started having trouble sleeping. Temperance Hutchkins wrote about this in her diary. According to her, Barnabas had started getting up in the middle of the night and walking outside, often not coming back until dawn. When she followed him one time, she saw him standing still in their yard, facing Mrs. Moravec's cottage, and staying that way for hours, even though it was very cold. Other families also had similar stories to share. They said that their loved ones were acting strangely at night, always while wearing there. Some were found standing in gardens or fields, while others were walking slowly along the river path that led to Mrs. Moravec's property. They were all completely still, and didn't seem to be aware of the cold, wind, or rain. Dr. Heath wrote about these events in his medical journal at first, thinking they might be cases of sleepwalking disorder. However, the coordinated and purposeful movements suggested they were doing something on purpose, rather than just wandering around aimlessly. What was even stranger was, when the affected people were awakened or questioned, they had no memory of leaving their homes and looked really confused about being outside. It wasn't until a traveling merchant named Mori Steenberg came through Cedar Ridge in February 1889 that they were able to figure out Mrs. Moravec's plan. Steenberg dealt in rare textiles and animal products all over the eastern states. Caldwell says that when Steenberg was shown examples of Mrs. Moravec's work, he reacted right away and was very scared. He carefully looked at the clothes before saying that the material was unlike anything he had ever seen before. It felt and behaved like fur from a big animal, but the hair structure and follicle patterns didn't match any known species. What scared him the most was that the material seemed to retain some form of cell activity, shown by small changes in texture and color when exposed to body heat. Steenberg's knowledge led him to a conclusion that Caldwell at first thought was impossible. The materials used in Mrs. Moravec's clothes were not from animals at all. They looked like they were made from processed human hair that had been treated in an unknown way to make it look and behave like fur. When asked for proof of this outrageous claim, Steenberg pointed to microscopic features that could be seen. He said that patterns of growth and cellular structure that could only be seen under a microscope were consistent with human rather than animal origins. This new and horrifying information shed a whole new light on Mrs. Moravec's business. If Steenberg's analysis was correct, the source of the materials used in her clothes raised too many disturbing questions to directly think about. The amount of hair needed to make even one coat would require harvesting from multiple human sources. There had been no reports of missing persons in Cedar Ridge or the nearby towns, so Jeremiah Caldwell was in a tough spot. Stetenberg's claims pointed to the worst kind of criminal activity, but there was no direct evidence to back them up. Mrs. Moravec kept running her business normally. Her customers were happy with their purchases, and it looked like no obvious crimes had been committed in the area. Despite this, Caldwell felt compelled to voice his concerns. The constable for Cedar Ridge and the surrounding township was Cyrus Whitman, a retired Army sergeant who had been in that position for 15 years. Whitman was known for taking a practical approach to law enforcement and not wanting to look into things based on rumors or speculation in the community. When Caldwell gave him Steinberg's evaluation of Mrs. Moravec's materials, Whitman was skeptical at first, but he agreed to do a separate investigation of Mrs. Moravec's activities. He was methodical and careful, and his goal was to get information without letting Mrs. Moravec know that the police were looking into her business. He started by looking at missing person reports from nearby towns, especially ones that might have happened while Mrs. Moravec was living in Cedar Ridge. He also asked about her background, trying to confirm her claims that she got money from family in Europe. The investigation turned up a number of disturbing facts. There were holes in Mrs. Moravec's story. Records from the mining company that had employed her late husband did not list a Cordelia Moravec and did not show any death benefits being paid to such a widow. Also, immigration records from the Port of Philadelphia did not show any entry for anyone matching her description during the time she said she came to America. What was more worrying was Whitman's discovery that similar businesses had been operating in other communities throughout Pennsylvania and New Jersey. During the 1880s in neighboring states, a woman who fit Mrs. Moravec's general description opened a textile workshop that specialized in unusual fur garments, ran it successfully for a few years, and then vanished without a trace, leaving no forwarding address or explanation for her departure. The pattern was surprisingly consistent. The businesses always started in small rural towns that didn't have easy access to bigger cities, and they always focused on a specific type of fur garment width. The business had some strange features and always had a loyal customer base that behaved in similar ways. Most importantly, each community reported a small but noticeable rise in missing person cases during the time it was open. However, these disappearances were usually thought to be due to the transient nature of rural populations rather than criminal activity. With this information, Constable Whitman decided to investigate Mrs. Moravec's property directly. Pennsylvania law allowed him to do so. Peace officers were allowed to check businesses when they had a good reason to think that something illegal was going on. Whitman made sure that his visit was seen as a normal question about business licensing and not a criminal investigation. When he arrived at Mrs. Moravec's cottage on March 15, 1889, she greeted him politely but clearly nervously and led him into the front part of her workshop, where she did fittings for customers and kept finished clothes in good shape. It was normal in every way, well organized, clean, and lacking anything that would suggest illegal activities. But when Whitman asked to see the back workshop area, Mrs. Moravec got angry. She said that it had things that were dangerous to handle improperly and chemicals used in her processing methods that could make people sick if they weren't trained. When Whitman insisted that he needed full access to the property, Mrs. Moravec screamed, reluctantly agreed, but insisted on going with him to make sure nothing was messed with. The rear workshop completely disappointed Whitman. It didn't have the big vats or rendering equipment that had been described before. Instead, it looked like an elaborate laboratory, with tables lined with glass containers, measuring tools, and other equipment that looked more like medical equipment than textile machinery. The sweet smell that neighbors had noticed. The smell was stronger here, coming from many sealed jars that looked like they contained different chemical solutions. What was most unsettling were the detailed diagrams that were stuck on the walls. They showed what looked like anatomical studies of human hair growth patterns, cellular structures, and processing methods. The level of scientific detail was far beyond what you'd expect from a simple clothing maker, showing knowledge of chemistry, biology, and medical procedures that would require. According to Mrs. Moravec, the equipment was needed for her specialized processing methods because turning raw materials into the finished fur-like texture required careful chemical treatment and precise temperature control. When Whitman asked her about her training in such technical procedures, she repeated what she had already said about family knowledge that had been passed down through generations, but her answers became more vague and contradictory. Whitman made the discovery when he looked at the storage area where Mrs. Morav kept her raw materials. He saw huge wooden containers with what looked like bundles of hair in different stages of processing. The amount of hair was so large that it would have taken hundreds of harvests to gather it all. When asked where the hair came from, Mrs. Moravec said it was from European suppliers who specialized in getting hair from willing donors, but she could not show any proof of this. After looking at the hair, Whitman found things that supported Steinberg's earlier conclusion. The hair's color variations, length patterns, and cellular structure did not match any animal fur. Instead, they were exactly like human hair in every way. What was most concerning was that many of the bundles seemed to have been taken from the source very recently, showing no signs of the wear and tear that would be expected from being stored for a long time. A dramatic turn when Whitman found a hidden compartment under the workshop floor. It contained detailed records of Mrs. Moravec's customers, but they showed information that had never been asked for in normal business transactions. The profiles of each customer included physical descriptions, personal habits, family relationships, and what looked like daily activity schedules, which suggests that the surveillance was for reasons other than just business. Of the surrounding area, marking specific locations with symbols that corresponded to individual customer profiles. Many of these locations seemed to represent remote areas along the river in wooded areas or near abandoned mines. When these locations were compared to the customer surveillance records, a disturbing pattern became clear. Customers were being tracked, their movements were being watched, and their access to remote areas was being carefully recorded. The last piece of evidence came from a journal, written in a language that Whitman could not identify, but which contained detailed sketches that left no doubt about Mrs. Moravec's true activities. The drawings depicted human figures in various states, processes that appeared to involve systematic harvesting of hair and what looked like disposal methods for remains. The level of detail and clinical precision suggested extensive experience with such procedures, faced with evidence of criminal activity beyond anything in his previous. Because of his experience, Whitman called the police in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia right away to ask for help. But when investigators from the city arrived 3 days later, Mrs. Moravec's cottage was empty. She had left during the night after Whitman's investigation, taking only portable tools and materials with her, and leaving behind the built-in equipment that would have been too heavy to carry. An investigation of the abandoned workshop turned up more evidence. That confirmed the worst fears about Mrs. Moravec's activities. Under the building, investigators found a carefully constructed disposal system that led to an underground chamber connected to the nearby river by a network of drainage channels. The chamber contained organic materials that had been broken down by what looked like an acid-based system, leaving behind only mineral residues and trace elements that needed to be identified in a lab. Chemical testing of residues found in the disposal chamber confirmed the presence of human remains, but because of how thoroughly they had been processed, it was not possible to identify any specific individuals. It was estimated that materials from dozens of different sources had been processed through the system during Mrs. Moravec's time living in Cedar Ridge, but only a small number of these could be linked to local missing person reports. The investigation grew to include looking into Mrs. Moravec's customers during her time in business. Dr. Heath's medical records were important proof that the clothes had been treated with chemicals that had psychological effects on the people who wore them. Chemical analysis of fabric samples showed traces of compounds that could cause transient states, make people less aware of their surroundings, and make people do obsessive things, like moving unconscious toward certain places at night. Using her customers as unwitting helpers in her scheme added another horrifying layer to the case. The midnight wanderings that families had seen were not random actions. They were part of a plan to bring victims to predetermined locations where they could be harvested without resistance. Customers were gradually kept away from community activities to make it less likely that their absences would be noticed or investigated. Customers recovered from the effects of the treated clothing. Dr. Heath found that people continued to have compulsive behaviors for weeks after they stopped wearing the contaminated clothing. Some people never fully recovered their old personalities, staying quiet and having permanent changes in their sleep patterns, appetite, and social interactions. For some customers, realizing they had been participating in Mrs. Moravec's activities without realizing it caused so much psychological trauma that they needed permanent help. The investigation also showed that Mrs. Moravec's business in Cedar Ridge wasn't her first or only one. Working with police in other states, they found a pattern of similar businesses that had been open for almost a decade and followed the same pattern of opening, running, and then suddenly closing. Based on the full scope of her activities, it looked like she had helped hundreds of victims in many communities, making her one of the most prolific criminals in American history. Law enforcement agencies from several states worked hard to find and arrest Mrs. Moravec, but she was never caught. During her time at Cedar Ridge, descriptions of her were so carefully controlled that even regular customers could only give vague details about how she looked. She seemed to know a lot about how to investigate crimes and had set up her identity and operation so that she would be hard to catch or chase. The case was still open in Pennsylvania. State records were kept until 1954, but active investigations stopped in 1892. Reports came in from time to time about possible sightings of similar operations in remote parts of the Western Territories, but none of them could be confirmed or definitively linked to the same person. As criminal investigation techniques got better and communication between law enforcement agencies got better, it became harder for Moravec to keep up the kind of operations he was doing without getting caught. That had housed Mrs. Moravec's operation was demolished by county authorities in 1890, and the site was declared unsuitable for residential construction due to contamination from the chemical processing that had occurred there. The property remained vacant until 1923 when it was converted to agricultural use after extensive soil treatment to remove toxic residues. Local residents continued to avoid the area, and the land changed hands multiple times before finally being incorporated into a larger, in the 1940s on a farm. Physical evidence from Mrs. Moravec's workshop was kept safe by Pennsylvania State Police and later given to the newly formed Federal Bureau of Investigation to be used in their studies of criminal methodology. The case was used to train investigators who specialize in serial crimes and showed how sophisticated criminals could be when they worked in remote areas with few resources. Communication infrastructure. The psychological impact of the Mrs. Moravec case on the Cedar Ridge community persisted for decades after her disappearance. Many families relocated to other regions, unable to remain in an area associated with such horrific discoveries. Those who stayed found that community social patterns had been permanently altered by the revelation that neighbors had been unknowingly participating in criminal activities. Trust between residents required years to rebuild, and the community never got back to being as close-knit as it was before 1888. Dr. Heath continued to treat people who had been to Mrs. Moravec's operation until he retired in 1912. His detailed medical records of their recovery gave us important information about the long-term effects of chemical manipulation and psychological trauma, which helped us understand what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Some of his patients never fully recovered their mental state. So they needed ongoing care. Lifelong medical care and support from family members. The case also led to changes in how businesses are licensed and supervised in rural Pennsylvania. Local authorities were given more power to inspect businesses, especially those using new materials or processing methods. Supply sources and processing procedures had to be better documented to stop similar businesses from starting up without being properly checked out. Caldwell's investigation led to the discovery of Mrs. Moravec's activities, but he never fully recovered from knowing about the case. According to letters from family members kept by the Cedar Ridge Historical Society, he had constant nightmares and became obsessed with making sure everyone in the community was safe. He eventually sold his general store and moved to Ohio, where he lived quietly until his death in 1919. Constable Cyrus Whitman was praised by state officials for his investigation of the case, but the experience marked the end of his career in law enforcement. He resigned his position 6 months after Mrs. Moravec's disappearance, stating that the case had revealed criminal possibilities he was not equipped to handle. He spent his remaining years as a farmer, avoiding any involvement in legal or investigative activities. The broader implications of the Mrs. Moravec case extended beyond the immediate criminal investigation to influence academic study of criminal behavior and community. Criminologists who studied the case said that the lack of transportation and communication systems in rural areas made them easy targets for determined criminals with enough time and planning. The case added to the case for better transportation and communication systems to make remote areas safer. Learning more about the case's history also showed how much planning and scientific knowledge was needed to pull off such an operation. Mrs. Moravec had demonstrated expertise in chemistry, psychology, anatomy, and criminal methodology that suggested formal education or training far beyond what her assumed background would indicate. This raised questions about whether she had operated independently or as part of a larger criminal organization with access to specialized knowledge and resources. The mystery of Mrs. Moravec's true identity was never resolved despite extensive investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies. No. Records that matched her description could be found in immigration records, educational institutions, or professional organizations that might have given her the scientific knowledge she showed. Her ability to run such a complex operation without being caught suggests either her own exceptional skill or help from sources that were never identified. In 1965, workers in Pittsburgh who were renovating an abandoned building found papers that seemed to be related to Mrs. The papers contained chemical formulas, processing instructions, and references to other places where similar operations might have been carried out. However, they had been stored for decades and had become very worn down. So much of the information was either unreadable or missing. What could be recovered supported previous evidence about how big and complex Morav's criminal enterprise was, but it didn't help in finding or identifying her. The Cedar Ridge community slowly lost hope. The Mrs. Morav case was very upsetting, but the memory of it changed local culture for generations. Stories about it were told from generation to generation, often changing or adding to what happened, but the main message stayed the same. Don't trust strangers who offer goods that seem too good to be true. The case became part of local folklore and served as a warning about the dangers that could hide behind seemingly harmless commercials. Today, criminal investigators studying old cases still find the Mrs. Moravec operation amazing because it used a complex mix of scientific knowledge, psychological manipulation, and well-thought-out planning. The case shows how criminal activities could go on for a long time in pre-modern communication environments by using isolation and limited information sharing to avoid being caught. The methods she used were similar to ones used by more modern criminals. Criminal organizations, which suggests either amazing creativity or access to information that was very far ahead of its time. The chemicals used to make the clothes that were the main part of Mrs. Moravec's business were never fully understood, even after a lot of research was done on recovered materials. The combination of chemicals used to treat hair, chemicals used for psychological manipulation, and textile processing methods showed a level of technical sophistication that was beyond what scientists knew at the time. Some parts of her method weren't fully explained until advances in organic chemistry and neuroscience made it possible to see the effects she had. What was most disturbing was realizing that Mrs. Moravec's operation wasn't just meant to get victims for processing. It was also meant to create a system that could keep going forever without being caught. This included psychologically conditioning customers, constantly watching people in the community, and carefully planning how to get rid of the bodies. Indicated long-term thinking that suggested she had intended to operate in Cedar Ridge for many years, rather than the brief period that actually occurred. Only Constable Whitman's investigation had disrupted what appeared to be a perfectly planned criminal enterprise. The broader question of how many similar operations might have existed during the same period remained unanswered. The limited communication and investigation capabilities of late 19th century law enforcement meant that criminal activities in remote areas often went undetected or were attributed to natural causes or accidents. Mrs. Moravec's sophisticated method suggested that other criminals might have been operating similar enterprises without ever being discovered or documented. Investigation records from the period indicate that several other communities reported unusual business operations involving unfamiliar materials or processing methods that created high-quality products with suspicious origins. Most of these reports were. Some rumors were written off as community chatter or local rumors, but later research showed that they might have been signs of criminal activities similar to those found in Cedar Ridge. Because law enforcement agencies didn't share information systematically, patterns that happened in more than one community weren't likely to be noticed or looked into. The case files related to Mrs. Moravec's business eventually became part of the research collection kept by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for training and historical purposes. These materials were hard for the public to get to because they contained disturbing evidence and detailed information about how the crime was carried out. Researchers interested in historical crime patterns or early investigative techniques could get permission to look at the files, but the public was not allowed to see them to protect people whose families had been affected by the original events. The federal government kept most of the materials until the 1960s, when they were destroyed according to standard procedures for getting rid of evidence. However, some samples of the treated clothes and materials used for chemical processing were kept for ongoing research into criminal methodology and toxicology. These samples sometimes helped investigators working on similar cases involving chemical manipulation of materials or psychological conditioning of victims. Moravec's customers gave early information about the effects of long-term exposure to behavior-altering substances and how to recover from such conditioning. Dr. Heath's detailed medical records were used as the basis for research that helped people understand how chemical agents could be used to control people's behavior without them being aware of it. This research led to later advances in forensic psychology and the treatment of victims. In cases involving systematic psychological manipulation, the community of Cedar Ridge never fully returned to how it was before 1888. It stayed a viable settlement for a few more decades, but the population slowly dropped as families moved away, and fewer people chose to live in an area linked to such infamous events. By the 1920s, Cedar Ridge had become mostly a collection of scattered farms, and the original town center was mostly gone. The area around Mrs. Moravec's cottage was eventually merged into nearby towns, and the name Cedar Ridge stopped being used. The location of her cottage was the subject of local folklore and superstition for many years after she went missing. Even after it was cleared and turned into farmland, people still reported strange things happening there, like smells that they couldn't explain, especially the sweet smell that came from her workshop, and sounds that sounded like someone was there when no one was there. Reports were mostly attributed to people's mental health being affected by the community's trauma rather than any real strange events. The former cottage site had to go through a lot of soil remediation to get rid of chemical contaminants left over from Mrs. Moravec's textile processing. Soil samples taken during the 1940s conversion showed high levels of different compounds that she had used in her methods. The cleanup involved removing several feet of contaminated soil and replacing it with new soil. The land had to be cleaned up before it could be safely used for farming. The river path that Mrs. Moravec's clients had been walking during their nighttime episodes became known as the Widow's Trail, and people avoided it for decades after she went missing. Eventually, the path became overgrown and impassable, but parts of it could still be seen until the area was developed in the middle of the 20th century. Some parts of the original path are now used for recreation, trails, but not many people who use them now know about the historical importance of the route. As Pennsylvania's rural areas became more modernized and better connected to cities, the kind of isolation that had let Mrs. Moravec work without being caught became less common. Better transportation, communication systems, and law enforcement coordination made it much harder for criminals to set up long-term operations in remote areas without drawing attention to themselves. The Mrs. Moravec case became part of there is evidence from the past of times when these kinds of criminal activities were technically possible in ways that would be very hard to do today. However, even now, more than a century later, there are still questions about the full scope and nature of Mrs. Moravec's activities. The complex methods, scientific knowledge, and organized way of choosing and processing victims all point to abilities and knowledge that challenge our understanding. It's scary to think that her success wasn't due to complex technology or large-scale organization, but to the trust of rural communities and the fact that they were cut off from the rest of the world, which kept terrible secrets hidden for too long. Some historians who have studied the case say that the real lesson isn't about the crimes themselves, but about how easily evil can look like business, and how easily people can be tricked when their basic needs aren't met. I also think about how thin the line is between civilization and the darkness that can be just beyond our grasp.